I'm 58 years old, and I've spent 40 of those years pulling a living from the cold, gray waters of Puget Sound, Washington. But I've never pulled up anything like the box that snagged my nets last Tuesday. It had no business being there, resting on my deck like a coffin dragged from the deep. And every instinct I have, every lesson the sea has ever taught me, screamed at me to cut it loose and let the abyss take it back. But I didn't. When the Coast Guard finally arrived, and their specialist saw the faded stenciling on its side, his face went as white as a gull's belly. He just stared at it, then at me, and all he said was, "You have no idea what you've done." What would you have done? Would you have touched it? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for the whole story, and tell me what city you're watching from. My name is Silas Croft. I'm 58 years old, and for most of those years, the rhythm of my life has been set by the tides of Puget Sound. It's in my blood. My father, John Croft, worked these same waters on a boat not much different from mine, and his father, William, before him. The Crofts and this sound, we have an understanding. It provides, it takes away, and it keeps its secrets buried, deep in the cold, green dark. My boat, the Sea Dog, she's not much to look at. Scarred hull, the smell of diesel and salt permanently soaked into her wood. But she knows these channels better than any chart. We have a routine, her and I. Out before the sun burns the fog off the water, checking the nets, reading the currents, listening to what the sea is telling me. It's a simple life, a hard life, but it's an honest one. You learn to trust your gut out here, because there's no one else to rely on when the weather turns and the shore is just a memory. That Tuesday started like 1,000 other Tuesdays. The fog was a thick, wet blanket, muffling the world until the only things that felt real were the deck beneath my boots and the low thrum of the engine. The light was gray, the water was gray, the sky was a slightly lighter shade of gray. It's a color palette you get used to. I'd had my coffee, a bitter black brew that could strip paint, and was on my last string of nets, the one I'd set just south of the naval base on Whidbey Island. It's a tricky spot. The currents are unpredictable, and the bottom is littered with a century's worth of junk, but the fish run deep there if you know where to look. I flipped the switch for the hydraulic winch, and the familiar groan and grind began, pulling the heavy net from the depths. At first, everything felt normal. The strain was steady, the boat listing just so. Then, about halfway up, the winch motor's pitch changed. It went from a healthy working groan to a high, tortured whine. The whole boat shuddered, and the line went taut as a guitar string. I cut the power immediately. My first thought was a rock outcropping. It happens. You snag the bottom, you lose a net, you curse the sea, and you move on. But this felt different. It wasn't the sharp, jarring stop of hitting rock. It was a heavy, sullen weight, a dead weight, that seemed to pull back with a life of its own. I tried to work it loose, reversing the winch, nudging the Sea Dog forward and back, trying to coax the net free. But whatever I had hooked, it wasn't letting go. It felt like I'd snagged the anchor of a ghost ship. The smell in the air changed, too. It wasn't just the usual brine and diesel. There was something else underneath it, a faint, metallic odor, like old rust and ozone, as if I'd disturbed something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. The fog was beginning to thin a little, the sun a pale, hazy disk trying to break through. I could just make out the dark silhouette of the island a few miles off. I spent the better part of an hour fighting with it. My frustration was growing, the cold seeping into my bones. I was about to give up, ready to take my knife and cut the whole damn rig loose, chalk it up as a loss. But something made me hesitate. A glint of something in the water, just below the surface where the net was tightest. Not the shimmer of fish scales, but a dull, metallic sheen. Curiosity, that old fisherman's folly, got the better of me. I decided to give it one more try. putting every bit of power the winch had into one slow, steady pull. The motors screamed in protest. The boat groaned. For a moment, I thought the line would snap, or worse, the winch would tear right off the deck. Then, with a deep, sucking sound, it broke free from the mud below. The weight was immense, far heavier than any rock I'd ever pulled up. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought it up. The net was a mangled mess, torn and twisted around a shape that was dark, rectangular, and utterly out of place. As it breached the surface, the water cascaded off its sides in a muddy, green waterfall. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't debris. It was a box. A massive, metal crate, about the size of a coffin, its surface covered in a thick layer of barnacles and slime that did little to hide the rusted steel beneath. It swung precariously from the winch for a moment, a dark pendulum against the gray sky, before I managed to guide it onto the deck. It landed with a sickening thud that vibrated through the entire boat, a sound of finality, of something arriving that was never meant to. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. The air suddenly felt colder. The only sounds were the lapping of the water against the hull and the lonely cry of a distant gull. The crate just sat there, a foreign object in my world, an ancient, malevolent thing dragged from a watery grave. It looked wrong. It felt wrong. Every instinct, honed by 40 years on this sound, was screaming at me. A deep, primal part of my brain told me this was something I should have left in the dark. It was a secret the sea had tried to keep, and I had just dragged it into the light. The question is, what would you have done? Would you have had the nerve to even get it on your boat? Or would you have cut the line and let the depths keep their secrets? Let me know your thoughts down below. And while you're at it, subscribe, and tell me what part of the world you're watching from. I've got a feeling this story is just getting started. The crate sat on my deck like a tombstone. The thud it made when it landed seemed to have sucked all the other sounds out of the world. The engine was idling, but I couldn't hear it. The gulls had gone silent. Even the water seemed to be lapping against the hull more quietly, as if it were afraid to disturb the thing it had given up. I just stood there, my hands still on the winch controls, my knuckles white. The cold morning air felt sharp in my lungs. For a long moment, I did nothing. I just stared. It was a foreign object in my world of wood, rope, and salt. It was all hard lines and dark metal, a piece of some other, harder world that had been sleeping in the mud for God knows how long. My first instinct, even now, was to push it back, to slide it right off the stern, and let it sink back into the green-black depths where it belonged. It would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But I couldn't. It was here now. It was my problem. Slowly, I let go of the controls and walked towards it, my boots making soft, hesitant sounds on the wet deck. The smell coming off it was stronger now, that metallic ozone scent mixed with the ancient rotten smell of the deep sea floor. It was covered in a thick carpet of barnacles and dark green sea slime, but underneath, I could see the dull gray of rusted steel. The corners were dented, scarred from its time tumbling in the currents, but the main body was solid. There were no obvious latches, no hinges, no locks. The seams were thick, heavy welds, done by a machine, not a man. This thing wasn't made to be opened. It was made to stay shut. Forever. I knelt, my old knees cracking in protest. I pulled out my gutting knife, the one I've had for 20 years, its blade worn thin from a million cuts, and started scraping at the slime on one of the long sides. It came away in thick, gelatinous sheets, revealing the pitted metal underneath. And then I saw them. Faint, but still there. Stenciled letters, painted in a faded white that was now a ghostly gray. I scraped more furiously, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The letters resolved into words. First, a simple, stark abbreviation, USN, United States Navy. My stomach tightened. That explained why I'd found it so close to the Whidbey base. Below that, another line. I had to scrape away a stubborn cluster of barnacles, their shells cracking under the pressure of my knife. Project. I squinted, leaning closer. The letters were faint. Chimera. Project Chimera. The name meant nothing to me, but it sounded wrong. Like something from a book my son used to read about monsters and myths. And then, at the very end of the line, a date, 1968. 1968. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. A cold wave washed over me that had nothing to do with the Puget Sound air. 1968. That was the year. The year my grandfather, William Croft, took his boat, the Albatross, out into this very same stretch of water and never came back. The official story was a freak storm that blew in without warning. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies, just gone. My father never believed it. He said my grandfather knew these waters better than he knew his own wife. He said there was no storm on the charts that day. But you don't argue with the Navy. You just accept their story and try to move on. Now here it was. That year. Painted on the side of a sealed Navy box I'd just pulled from the same patch of sea that took him. It couldn't be a coincidence. The sea is vast, but it's not that vast. My hand, of its own accord, reached out and touched the metal. I expected it to be cold, of course. It had been in 38-degree water for who knows how long. But this was a different kind of cold. It was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth right out of my fingertips, right out of my bones. It felt like touching a block of dry ice. It was unnatural. And then I felt it. A vibration. It was so faint, at first I thought I was imagining it. Just the thrum of my own boat's engine running through the deck. I shut the engine off. The world went completely silent, except for the water. I pressed my palm flat against the cold steel. There it was again. A low, steady hum. A deep, resonant frequency that vibrated right up my arm. Something inside this box, this coffin from 1968, was still running. After more than 50 years in the crushing, silent dark, something inside was still alive. That's when the curiosity turned into a cold, hard knot of fear in my gut. What in God's name was in there? I stood up and backed away, my eyes locked on the crate. My mind was racing. Some kind of engine? A battery? A weapon? I had to know. I went to my toolbox and grabbed the biggest, heaviest crowbar I owned. It felt flimsy in my hands as I approached the crate again. I found a spot on the welded seam that looked slightly weaker, a spot where the rust was deeper. I jammed the tip of the crowbar in and put all my weight on it. The only sound was a high-pitched metallic screech as the crowbar scraped against the steel. The seam didn't budge, not a millimeter. I tried again, grunting with the effort, my muscles straining. Nothing. The crate was a solid, immovable block. It mocked my efforts. It was clear this thing was never meant to be opened by a fisherman with a crowbar. I dropped the tool with a clang. I was breathing heavily, a cold sweat on my brow. This was bigger than a lost piece of military gear. This was a secret. A secret that had been kept for over 50 years, and that low, steady hum was telling me it was still a live one. I knew I couldn't handle this. I couldn't just haul it to shore, and I sure as hell wasn't keeping it. I needed to make a call. But who? Calling the Maine Coast Guard dispatch felt wrong. An open channel, a formal report, it would be out of my hands in an instant. The story would be whatever they wanted it to be. I thought of my grandfather. I thought of that date. I needed someone I could trust. I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed a direct number. It rang twice. "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "It's Silas. I need you to come out to my position. And Marcus, come alone, and come quiet." I could feel his hesitation over the line. But he knew me. He knew I wasn't a man who spooked easy. "I'm on my way," he said. As I stood there, waiting, with that humming coffin on my deck, the fog began to close in again, swallowing the world in a blanket of gray. I looked at the box, at the name, Chimera, at the year, 1968. I had pulled a ghost from the water. I had to. But looking at it now, feeling that deep, unnatural cold, I have to ask, would you have had the courage to pull this onto your boat? Or would you have cut the line and let the sea keep its secrets? Let me know what you would have done. And make sure you're subscribed, because when Marcus's boat finally cut through that fog, he wasn't alone, and the story was about to get a whole lot deeper. The wait felt longer than a winter night. The fog had become a solid gray wall, and my world had shrunk to the 38 feet of Asterisk the Sea Dog, Dubus deck, and the humming metal coffin that sat in its center. The cold it gave off seemed to be pushing the fog away in an invisible, shimmering circle. I paced, I checked my lines, I drank coffee I couldn't taste. Every creak of the boat, every slap of water against the hull made me jump. I kept glancing at the crate, half expecting the humming to grow louder, for the lid to start moving. I was a man who'd spent his life in a world governed by tides, wind, and the habits of fish. This box, it followed no rules I knew. It was a piece of the unnatural dropped into the very heart of my life. Then, a new sound cut through the silence. The low, powerful thrum of a diesel engine, much bigger than mine. A shape began to resolve itself in the mist, a sharp, gray bow slicing through the water. It was a Coast Guard cutter, Marcus's boat, but as it drew alongside, my relief curdled in my stomach. Marcus was at the helm, his face pale and grim, but he wasn't alone. Standing on his deck were two other people, a man and a woman, dressed in dark, practical jackets, with no insignia, no markings at all. They weren't Coast Guard. They weren't cops. They looked sterile, like they'd just stepped out of a laboratory and onto the deck of a fishing boat. They moved with a quiet, efficient purpose that was more unnerving than any shouted order. They didn't wait for an invitation. The moment the cutter was secured to mine, they were over the rail. They didn't greet me. They didn't even seem to see me. Their eyes went straight to the crate, and they froze, their expressions hidden behind a professional mask that didn't quite conceal a flicker of something. Maybe awe, maybe fear. The man was carrying a heavy-duty Pelican case. He set it on the deck, opened it, and pulled out a device that looked like something from a science fiction movie, a handheld scanner with a small screen and a long metallic wand. Without a word, he approached the crate and began to slowly pass the wand over its surface. The device emitted a series of low, rhythmic clicks. Marcus came over to me, his boots loud on the deck. "Silas, what in God's name did you do?" he whispered, his eyes wide, fixed on the two strangers. That direct line, it flagged certain keywords. When you said your position and sealed container, it went up the chain so fast I got the call before I could even get my coat on. Before I could answer, the clicking from the scanner stopped. It was replaced by a high, steady whine. The man with the scanner stared at his screen, his knuckles white where he gripped the device. He looked at his partner, his professional calm completely gone. "My God," he breathed, the words barely audible over the whine of his machine. "It's still active. The biological signature is dormant, but the power source, it's still online, full integrity." The woman knelt, pulling a small thermal camera from her own kit. She aimed it at the crate. "Core temperature is stable at -20 Celsius. It's holding, but the power readings are fluctuating." "Silas," she said, her voice sharp, looking at me for the first time. "Did you hit it? Try to open it." I just nodded, numbly, pointing at the crowbar lying on the deck. A look of pure terror flashed across her face before she got it back under control. "Don't touch it again," she ordered. "Don't even get close to it." Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me to the stern of my boat, as far from the crate and the specialists as we could get. His grip was tight, his hand trembling slightly. "Silas, you need to listen to me," he said, his voice a low, urgent rush. "What I'm about to tell you, you never heard. Not from me. Not from anyone. Understand?" I just stared at him, the pieces of a puzzle I never knew existed starting to slam together in my mind. "Project Chimera," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. It wasn't just some forgotten piece of hardware. It was a Cold War bioweapon program. Top secret. Theoretical stuff, mostly. They were trying to create a self-sustaining biological agent, something that could lie dormant in cold water for decades, indefinitely, waiting for a trigger signal. My blood ran cold. I looked back at the crate, at the two people in black treating it like an unexploded bomb. "A bioweapon," I stammered. "Here? In the Sound?" Marcus shook his head, running a hand over his face. "It was never supposed to be here. The official report, the one they declassified 20 years ago, said the plane carrying the only prototypes went down in the deep Pacific, somewhere off the Aleutian Islands, back in '68. They declared everything lost. End of story." He looked me dead in the eye. "It was a lie, Silas. It has to be. That thing was never in the Pacific. It's been down there, right under your keel for over 50 years. The year hit me again, harder this time. 1968. The year my grandfather disappeared. The year of the freak storm that never was. I felt the deck shift under my feet, my world tilting on its axis. He wasn't lost in a storm. He was out here, on a calm day, just like this one. What did he see? Did he snag one of these things in his nets too? Did he get it on his deck? Did he try to open it? The questions hammered at me, each one more horrifying than the last. My family's tragedy wasn't an accident of nature. It was a secret, buried in a steel box at the bottom of the sea. I had spent my life thinking the sea took him, but it was them, the people who built this thing. They took him, and they covered it up with a story about the weather. I looked at the crate, this humming tomb that had held my family's truth for 2 generations. The specialists were talking in low, coded language, setting up more equipment. The thing on my deck wasn't just a piece of history. It was a weapon. And according to their scanner, it was still alive. I have to ask you, if you were in my boots, standing on that deck, knowing what you now know, would you have had the courage to pull something like that from the water in the first place? Let me know. I'm not sure I would have, if I'd known. Make sure you subscribe, because you're going to want to hear what happened when the helicopter showed up. The high-pitched whine of the scanner was suddenly drowned out by a sound that didn't belong in my world. It wasn't the sea, and it wasn't a boat. It was a deep, rhythmic chopping, a heavy whump-whump-whump that seemed to beat the fog itself into submission. We all looked up. A shadow appeared in the gray ceiling above us, growing larger, darker, resolving into the shape of a helicopter. It wasn't Coast Guard white and orange. It was a flat, menacing black, with no markings, no numbers, nothing to say who it belonged to. It hovered over my small boat with an unnatural stability, the downdraft churning the calm water around us into a frenzy, sending cold spray across the deck. Things moved fast then. The 2 specialists didn't need instructions. They worked with a silent, practiced efficiency that was terrifying to watch. They produced a heavy-duty cargo net and a harness from their own gear, strapping it around the crate with swift, precise movements. They attached a thick cable that was lowered from the helicopter's belly. There was no conversation, no wasted motion. They were a machine, and the crate was just a component to be removed. I stood there, on my own boat, feeling like a ghost. I didn't exist. My 40 years on this water, my ownership of the very deck they stood on, it meant nothing. I was just a witness, and a temporary one at that. The man who had used the scanner gave a sharp, upward gesture with his hand. The helicopter's engine roared, the cable went taut, and the crate, my impossible discovery, the source of that deep, bone-chilling hum, lifted off my deck. It didn't scrape or drag. It just rose, clean and smooth, a dark rectangle ascending into the gray void. It swung once, a terrible pendulum, and then it was gone, swallowed by the fog and the clouds. The helicopter's noise faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a sudden, ringing silence. The two specialists packed their gear, their faces as blank and unreadable as they were when they arrived. They stepped back onto the cutter without a word, without a look back. Just as Marcus was about to cast off the lines, another man appeared on his deck. He was older, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that looked absurdly out of place on the water. His shoes were polished. His face was a placid mask of polite authority. He stepped onto Asterisk the Sea Dog as if he were stepping into a boardroom, his movements calm and deliberate. He stopped a few feet from me, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight, "my name is not important. On behalf of the United States government, I want to thank you for your assistance today." He gestured vaguely at the empty space on my deck where the crate had been. "You've located a lost weather buoy. An old one, from a decommissioned program. Its internal battery was beginning to degrade, and it was critical that we retrieve it before it contaminated the area." He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "A check will be sent to you to cover the cost of your damaged nets and your time. A generous one." I just stared at him. A weather buoy. The lie was so blatant, so disrespectful it almost made me laugh. Project Chimera, a biological signature, a power source, still active after 55 years. None of that mattered. The story was now. Weather buoy. That's all it would ever be. "I know what I saw," I said, my voice hoarse. "I saw the name. I saw the year." His smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes went hard and cold, like a winter tide. "You saw a rusted piece of equipment, Mr. Croft. The sea plays tricks on the eyes, and names on old equipment are often reused for different, more mundane projects. It would be unfortunate if a different story were to circulate. Misinformation can cause unnecessary public concern. We trust you understand the importance of discretion." It wasn't a request. It was an order, wrapped in the silk of civility. He nodded once, a gesture of dismissal, and stepped back onto the cutter. The lines were cast off, and Marcus's boat pulled away, disappearing into the fog, leaving me alone with the ghosts. I stood on my deck for a long time, the silence pressing in on me. They took the crate. They took the evidence. But they couldn't take the feeling. I can still feel it now, days later. That low, steady hum is a phantom vibration in the bones of my hands. The unnatural cold is a permanent chill deep in my marrow. They can create a story, but they can't erase the truth. 1968. The year my grandfather, William Croft, took the Albatross out into this very stretch of water and vanished, lost in a freak storm on a calm day. He wasn't lost. He was silenced. He must have found one too. Maybe he tried to open it. Maybe he just saw something he wasn't supposed to see. They didn't just take a crate from me that day. They took the last piece of my grandfather. The official story, the one Marcus told me they declassified, was that all the Project Chimera prototypes were lost in a plane crash in the deep Pacific. But the one I found wasn't in the Pacific. It was here, sleeping in the mud of Puget Sound. They told me it was the only one, a forgotten piece of history. But as I stand here on my deck, looking out at the endless gray water, I can't help but wonder. They lied about where it was. They lied about what it was. What if they lied about how many there were? What if mine wasn't the only one? And you, what do you think was really behind all this? A simple military cover-up, or something more? Let me know your theories in the comments below. They told me to forget what I saw, but some things you can't unsee. Subscribe to the channel, because I have a feeling the sea isn't done giving up its secrets.